Welcome to the show. This is Brandon Wen, and you're listening to the Understanding Consumer Neuroscience podcast, brought to you by the folks at Cloud Army. In this episode, Richard talks to Darren Bridger about consumer neuroscience testing.
Hi, this is Richard Campbell, and thanks for listening to this series on consumer neuroscience and just trying to get to understand it. Today, my guest is Darren Bridger. And Darren, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, I look after the test design at Cloud Army, and I've been working in the field of consumer neuroscience for just a little over 20 years across a range of different companies and using different consumer neuroscience techniques. My background is in psychology. Okay.
So came in as into psychology. What drew you to consumer neuroscience? Like, how do you land there? It doesn't sound like the thing you planned in high school.
No, and it didn't really exist as an industry when I got into it. I happened to meet a psychologist when I was still doing my undergraduate degree, when I was on a scuba diving course and started working with him part-time. His name was Dr. David Lewis. He had been experimenting with EEG, electroencephalography, for studying TV ads.
Interesting. So literally measuring exactly how the brain reacts, or at least with the accuracy of that instrument to television.
Yeah, and initially just because TV ads were a good stimulus, because they were short and would engage people quickly and create emotional responses and that kind of thing. But it also seemed that it could be a good potential measure for the advertising research industry. That was really my beginning point, starting with EEG and biometrics.
But this all gets to this original idea. In the first show I did here with Tom, we were talking about this idea that people explain their responses to things, or their reactions to things, the decisions they make. I don't know how I don't want to say they lie, but it's like they need to have a reason.
Yes, I think we have a very compelling need for our behavior or our personality to appear to be consistent to ourselves. And therefore it's uncomfortable for us to not understand why we're behaving as we're behaving. So there's a term that often gets used, confabulation, to refer to people kind of making up plausible theories for why they did something, even if they don't really know why they did it, or choosing something.
I've certainly had those experiences around things like focus groups where, people want to give you answers. They're really kind, actually. They're trying to help you, but they may not necessarily understand why they've reacted to something the way they have, or why they pick that product over another product.
Yes, and I've sat and watched focus groups, and I wouldn't say that focus groups are useless. I think most of the traditional research techniques still have their place. But you see funny things in focus groups happening, like if you're just an observer sitting at the side, you can see often a leader of the group will kind of bubble to the surface.
Right.
And people will, in the rest of the people in the group will kind of take their cues from that leader. It might be somebody that's particularly articulate, and they'll use a particular phrase or a word, and then you'll start to hear other people in the group using that word as well. So there's kind of interesting group dynamics, I think.
And you have that effect of everybody tends to want to agree in the group too. So I know of someone, someone who's run a focus group, it's like when you see that leader emerge, you try to ask them last to see if you can get different opinions coming out, because they also tend to have sort of strong opinions about things and more, maybe a bit more willful. And so, and you'll see the rest of the room look to that person even when you ask them a question, rather than just postulate maybe a conflicting idea.
I think there's also a sense in which they can make you overthink something to an unnatural degree. And you've probably had the experience where you've thought about something a lot more than you typically would, and you found yourself changing your mind in the process of focusing on it more intensely than you usually would. Given that most of the things that marketers are interested in, be it TV ads or packaging designs, are really something that we respond to in a kind of an automatic, relatively low attention state. there are some advantages, therefore, in not getting people to overthink their responses to these things.
And I've certainly read the books that say people make that decision in a moment about a product and then spend time justifying that instinctual decision.
Yes, I think a lot of, for example, if you take a visit to the supermarket, it would literally be impossible for you to decide rationally on the basis of cost and volume calculations every single purchase that you're going to make in that supermarket. So you're looking for very quick gut feelings of how you react to the packaging of products. And of course, a lot of your buying behavior will be just habitual anyway. You'll have your favorite brands and your favorite products.
This reminds me of a story. It was an orange juice, wasn't it? Where they changed their packaging and their sales dropped off massively because people preferred the brand, but recognized it by its color in the box. And as soon as they changed that in any way, people couldn't find the product anymore.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of the testing that we do with packaging is around that findability factor. Which design cues are people using to find their favorite product?
Wow, that's really interesting. Because again, if I show someone a package and ask them like what appeals to you, I can't imagine that any of that information is credible. Because it's got context problems. Like I'm handing you the product. I've already told you this is the product that's important to me. Like I really created a circumstance for maximum confabulation. Like you're going to come up with a way to make me happy.
We'll often see people give explanations for why they prefer something that don't seem to be borne out by their behavior. So I'll give you an example. We did a project recently where it was packaging in a supermarket, and we were comparing different design options for this packaging. And one of the things that we were measuring was eye tracking. So where people were looking when the product was displayed in a shelf display.
Interesting.
And then we asked people as a survey question, because we'll often add in just good old-fashioned survey questions into our testing as well. Which pack do you prefer? And why do you prefer it? And there was a particular pack that people said that they preferred because they thought it was eye-catching.
Interesting.
It had bright colors and they thought it was eye-catching. But if you looked at the eye-tracking data, you could see that they were not looking at the pack sooner than any other design.
Right.
And they were not looking at it for longer than any other design. So they were just kind of assuming, oh, this has got bright colors, therefore it must be eye-catching. It stands out to me, that's why I like it.
It's straight confabulation.
Yeah. There are a funny series of published experiments where in some of the cases they set up one of these testing tables in a supermarket. Have you seen where they're giving samples out for you to test some new food or drink? And they had a series of jams and they were asking people to test these different jams. I don't know if you call them jellies over there, basically different flavored spreads, and then indicate which was their favorite one, which did they like the taste of most. And once people had done that, they then said, okay, we're going to give you a second taste of this jam. And we'd like you to explain to us why you think that's your favorite flavor. And they did a kind of a sort of a magic trick in that these bottles of jam were actually double-ended. And they flipped the bottle over without the person noticing. When they were given the second taste of the jam, it was actually a different flavor of jam.
Oh my, okay.
Not only did a majority of people not notice that it was a different flavor, I think it was in the region of about 3/4 of people didn't notice it was a different flavor, but they were still able to give an explanation for why it was their favorite flavor.
Oh, lovely.
And a very, very similar thing was replicated with tea.
Yeah.
And was even, funnily enough, replicated with photographs of faces where people were shown pairs of faces and asked which they found most attractive. And then on the second showing, they saw a different face and were still able to justify why they thought it was most attractive.
That was the more attractive face, yeah. I am prone to good whiskey tastings. When I'm with some folks that all really like whiskey, I will often slip a brandy into the middle of that. Because often it's very tough to tell. You know, there's not a lot of difference between a highly distilled barley soaked in oak barrels versus a highly distilled fruit soaked in oak barrels. They are subtle differences, and often, tasting is pretty subjective. It's a tricky thing to really pick up on. I just like the humility of that too. That just like, hey, you can't always tell. It's okay. But I do really appreciate that when we ask someone a question, they're going to try to answer, but the answer may not be valuable in the sense that it's been confabulated because they're trying to answer.
Yes. So that can obviously lead you astray if you're trying to design something that's going to appeal to the maximum number of consumers out there. Just asking them questions can lead you astray.
I can also think as a marketer, I'm coming into this with a bias. I like my product, and I have a belief of the sort of folks that I think are going to want more of my product. Like my biases are probably going to show up in these surveys because of the way that I present information and the way that I gather it.
Yes, I think there is a danger of that. I guess a good traditional researcher, when I say traditional, I mean somebody that's using traditional research techniques, will have ways to minimize their bias. But yes, I think that's true. And that's definitely an important consideration.
Sure. And you come from a psychology background, and presumably we're trained in the testing side of trying to construct tests to minimize your bias.
Yes. And there are schools of qualitative research that are very, very aware of the fact that you can't really separate out the researcher from the research. And it's more a case of just trying to understand what your biases might be and how they might be affecting the research.
Absolutely. So can we dig into this, how you construct a neuroscience test? I really like the packaging one because I think that's an incredibly hard thing to focus group in a meaningful way. Does consumer neuroscience work well for figuring out package selection?
I think so, and it's certainly one of the areas that we do a lot of work in. And I think designing a really good pack, particularly for fast-moving consumer goods, the sorts of things that you buy in supermarkets, is really, really hard. It's a little bit like, probably harder than trying to paint a really, really good painting. In following that analogy, if you could think of a supermarket as kind of like an art gallery where you're trying to capture people's attention and you're trying to emotionally engage them, a good pack has got to do a number of things to do that in terms of grabbing attention and drawing them in emotionally.
Yeah, because if you're going to use the art gallery scenario, the art around it matters. It's not just your package; it's the packages it's surrounded by.
Yes, it's kind of like the law of the jungle where, however sophisticated you get with your packaging design, your competitors will react, and it's a constant arms race in terms of standing out against the competition.
Sure. And there's the other element. I'm thinking back to that orange juice story where the customer already had a preference for that product. They're trying to find that product amongst the others. So you've got that marketing side of, I've already built a successful brand, but I will need that brand to be findable in this scenario too.
Yes, that's really one of the starting points for us. Some of the things that we look at, you can't look at with traditional research. We're using different tools and new measures, but it's also about a different way of looking at things. And some of the things that we test might seem quite simple, but they're often forgotten about. So, for example, designers will often be thinking at a very high conceptual level when they're designing packaging, and they'll be thinking about, what does this icon convey? There's a whole area of semiotics around use of particular shapes and icons to convey something. But often the lower level things get missed. And one of the lower level things that we examine when we're looking at packaging is simply how well does it stand out on the shelf.
Right.
And there's a measure called visual saliency, which is essentially a series of rules that are built into the visual system of all of us, that are common to all of us and not based on culture or where you grew up or anything like that. And it's simply, if you imagine when you see something new for the first time, for example, if you walk into a room for the first time and you've got no idea what's in that room, how does your brain know where to direct your eyes to first focus?
Right.
And there's a little algorithm that's running in our visual system that says whatever appears to be the most different area in the visual field, focus on that first. If you were looking at a chessboard black and white squares and somebody had painted one of the squares in pink, that would be the area that you look at first.
Sure. I mean, this goes right back to your sort of primitive brain, like look for the tiger in the forest kind of thing. What's the thing that's the most dangerous is going to be the odd thing.
And here's the weird thing. We consciously think that we look at things that we're interested in. But often it's the other way around. We become interested in the things that we're looking at. So we don't necessarily know why our eyes happen to be looking at something. And it's probably because it has this visual saliency effect, that it has some greater contrast against its surroundings. It's the most different thing in terms of color or other forms of contrast.
So there's a part of our subconscious mind that's directing our eyes to that because of this, contrast piece, and then our thinking mind rationalizes that effectively. Why am I looking here? Oh, that's where the tiger is.
Yeah, and there's some evidence that if you make a piece of packaging more visually salient, people are more likely to select it, even if it's not their usual favorite brand. So just a very low level thing like that can have an impact on the success of a piece of packaging.
This strikes me as like the arms race of websites, where the ads got more and more obnoxious to create visual saliency, right? To the point where I think most people to this day are blind to anything down the right side of a web page, because that's where the obnoxious ads go.
Yes. And I think something similar is going on with YouTube in terms of the thumbnail designs that people use.
Oh, yeah.
On the previews. Those are often kind of converging on a set range of colors that they know are most likely to grab attention.
But we use this term clickbait, right? That we're creating things that create visual saliency but are actually lies. So the thing that caught your eye and that you rationalized to that made you click on it turns out not to be what the thing was.
Yes. So they're kind of attentional junk food, I guess you could say.
Yeah, we can get your attention. We just can't actually give you the thing you want. And I'm trying to balance this against making a package. It's like, I want to stand out against my competitors on that shelf, but I don't want to be junk food. Like, I guess I still have to be honest about this is still orange juice.
Right. So that's where there are other layers to making successful packaging. So, for example, you could pick a color. Let's say that you're selling coffee. You could pick a color that none of the other packages of coffee are using, but it might feel completely wrong for coffee.
Right.
It might be a color that's more often associated with bleach or some kind of product that is completely non-appetizing. So it has to feel right. And it has to stand out, but it has to feel right. It has to ideally be as close as possible to what people expect it should look like, that it's not going to be confusing to them. And if it's a particular brand, then there will be colors and icons and cues that people will be looking for if they're searching for your particular brand.
Right.
So there's a number of different things that it would need to balance out.
So I think we have all these different variables now. Is this literally like the science process? No, let's create a hypothesis that these elements combine together. This particular version of the package combine these elements in a particular way, and now we can go out and test it?
Well, we work in different ways with clients. So we will sometimes have inputs into the design options that they're creating for packaging.
Right.
Sometimes they will just come to us and say, here we have these different designs that our designers have created. Please, can you test them against the different success criteria that we've come up with?
So yeah, you may have a design agency brought in and said, these are the designs that'll be the best for you, or maybe more than one. And you have to actually pick. And so Neuroscience can help you pick?
Yes. So there will be, typically the brand will have given their designers a brief around what kinds of associations or feelings they want the pack to convey to shoppers.
Okay.
And then those particular feelings might be something that we're measuring in our tests. Often we might do a kind of a full 360 evaluation of a pack in terms of its visual saliency, its findability, how quickly people can find it within a competitive array of other products. Does it convey automatically the things that the brand owner wants it to convey? Does it feel like it belongs to their brand? does it automatically evoke some kind of feeling of desire amongst consumers to buy it? So a range of different questions we can address.
Now, how do you arrange a test like that? Like, what does a test like that look like in neuroscience?
Well, we have a kind of a toolbox of different basic tests. Many of our tests are based around response timing. So there are a whole class of tests called implicit testing that we use. And there are similar tests that are also based around response timing, but are different from implicit tests. Implicit tests are measuring an automatic, non-conscious response in people.
Okay.
A kind of a gut feeling, automatic response you can't control. Is this design automatically communicating to me that it's sweet, let's say, versus giving you a question, do you think this looks sweet? But measuring how long you take to respond. There's a construct in psychology called attitude accessibility. And it's simply how quickly does a particular attitude come to mind? If I say to you, do you like chocolate? You probably can answer that automatically almost.
Yes.
If I said to you, something more obscure, like, do you think you would like peanut butter on apple? You might have to think about that for a split second longer,
right? Because
you haven't encountered it before. There's a difference between attitudes that you kind of have to construct and might take a little bit of time versus those that are almost like reflex responses. And the closer an attitude is to a reflex response, the more likely it is to drive your behavior.
Interesting. So if I'm understanding you, then the fact that you can respond to that quickly shows that it's a reflex response and so probably more accurate.
It's probably going to be more likely to be a consistent response in that person.
Interesting.
And it's probably more likely to predict their behavior. But there are, maybe I'm jumping ahead here, but there are considerations within those types of tests to make sure that you're genuinely measuring their decision response time as opposed to their response time to read the question or to visually process the image that you're showing them.
The point being, the more they think about it, the more the result is questionable. Like, you're after those reflexive things, right? And I'm thinking back to our conversation so far, and it's like, hey, most of the time when I'm shopping in a grocery store, I'm not thinking that much about each purchase. So if we can measure the reflexive things, we're also measuring the most likely response in the grocery store, which is that reflexive, oh, that's the thing I want, moving on.
Yes.
So that as soon as we get into longer responses, it's not even accurate or less accurate. It's like, you're not doing that in the grocery store. So that measure is not particularly relevant. What you are doing is the reflexive thing. So let's measure the reflexive things.
Exactly. And I think that gets to a core kind of principle in consumer neuroscience, which is the idea that our brains are a relatively small proportion of our body mass. Mm-hmm. So I think it's around 2% of our body mass, but they consume about a quarter of our energy consumption.
Right.
And throughout our evolutionary history, we had to develop modes of thought that would require the least amount of energy.
Yeah.
Because back in the day, it could have made the difference between survival and not surviving if we were using up too much energy.
Yeah, the humans that have survived to this point are the ones that needed less fuel.
Yes.
Required less energy to still survive.
Yes.
Like that's a really interesting balance.
Yes.
And let's face it, the modern grocery store is a tricky place to survive. So,
well, we've developed all these kind of automatic preferences that have an implication when you're trying to design something that will appeal to people.
Yeah. If we go back to sort of primitive sort of that hunter-gatherer time, it's like, can you quickly decide that's a safe berry or an unsafe berry?
Yeah.
Because if you have to study each berry to eat it, you're going to eat far fewer berries.
Exactly.
So this is an incredible power to be able to quickly decide in the majority of cases, recognizing that being wrong and eating a bad berry is far more hazardous than dropping skipping a few good berries. There's that implicit bias, but still be able to eat as many berries as you can in the time available to you.
And do I recognize this berry? If I recognize it, recognize that I've eaten it before, then it's probably okay.
Right.
Or do I recognize this face? If this is a face that I recognize, this person is probably not a threat to me. There's a real power in familiarity, and for various reasons, our brains also get confused or can't easily tell the difference between things that they find easy to process and things that are familiar.
Mm-hmm.
So we have this automatic preference for things that are familiar. One of the instances of that in the psychology literature is a thing called the mere exposure effect. If you've only been just exposed to something once, you will have a slight preference for that thing versus things that you've never seen before.
Right.
And the more you see something, the more you'll tend to prefer it. This effect, the mere exposure effect, or preference for familiar things, also gets kind of entangled with things that are very easy for you to visually decode. So one of the implications of that is that if you can make a design as simple as possible, yet still communicating the things that you need it to communicate, it will tend to be more effective.
Right.
It requires less brain energy for the person to decode.
And certainly we've seen things that are unnecessarily complicated. I'm still wrestling with what one of these tests look like. Do you typically test like from a computer or in person? Like, I think during pandemic, like the computer approach would be really useful, but I'm still envisioning, like, do you simulate the shelf of all the different products and say, click on this one or click on the right one, or which one do you click on first?
Almost everything that we do is online,
mm-hmm.
and we can accept participants in on desktops or laptops or mobile devices, and even using their webcam, we can do eye tracking.
Interesting.
Yeah, if the person has consented to allow us to use the webcam to do that.
And is eye tracking an essential part of this, or is the click enough?
I think of it as a toolbox of different types of tests, and
okay.
Each test will be appropriate for answering particular questions. So the response time questions that I mentioned before are a series of tests that have come from psychology labs around the world that have been developed to measure people's attitudes towards images. And often they've come from social psychology and around measuring people's attitudes towards different groups, be they racial groups or gender,
mm-hmm.
to understand people's automatic biases.
Interesting.
So things that people might have biases that they're not willing to or able to verbally express, but they can be measured through these response time tests.
And so you're measuring the time it took me to click, not necessarily what I clicked on?
Yes. So we'll give you, there are indirect tests. So we're not directly asking you a question, but we'll set up a sorting task.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll say, depending on the type of test, the task might be along the lines of, you're going to see the words tasty, or the phrase tasty or not tasty, flash up on the screen in front of you. And you're going to sort those words to the left or the right of the screen. And we'll give you a little reminder. On the right of the screen, you'll see the word tasty, and on the left of the screen, you'll see the words not tasty.
Okay.
And the words will flash up in a random sequence in the center of the screen. And you're simply clicking keys, arrow keys on your keyboard, or you're swiping on your tablet, or you're pressing on your tablet just to sort those words.
Okay.
We're getting a kind of a baseline response from you in terms of how quickly you're able to process those words and how quickly you react to those words. Because you might be a gamer and you might be really quick to respond compared to somebody who's not a gamer, or maybe you've just been doing something that sensitized you to the word tasty, or whatever it might be, that you might have a different response time.
But you're looking at the individual timings of each one of my clicks relative to me rather than to anyone else.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes. And then in this particular type of test that I'm describing here, and there are other paradigms, but in this particular type of test, it uses a psychological effect known as priming. And what priming is that whenever you see something, all the things that you associate with that thing become more readily available to your brain, to your mind.
Right.
So an example I give of this that a lot of people have experienced in everyday life is you may have bought, let's say, a new car or a new jacket, and suddenly you see that car everywhere you're going on the streets. Yes. And it's obviously not because suddenly everyone's bought it just directly after you bought it. It's because you're sensitized, you're primed to notice it more.
Yeah, it's like you've loaded into your mind the image recognizer for that particular car. And so if there are any of those cars around, you're going to see them now, where normally you're not discriminating the different cars.
Exactly, yes.
Okay.
So the way that we use it in the test is that we'll carry on with this word sorting game, and we'll begin to present images immediately before you see the word. So an image will appear, and there are particular timings that have been discovered that are most effective in terms of when the image appears, for how long it appears, and the gap in time between the image and the word, in order to evoke this automatic priming effect. But if I show you an image of something like a really, let's say, delicious milkshake, you're going to be a little bit faster to respond if the word tasty appears after that image than if it was an image of something that, I don't know, a bowl of cabbage or something that you don't think is tasty at all.
Yeah, you're getting into a challenge now of people's personal preferences too, right? The lactose intolerant sees the milkshake and is not that excited about it.
Right. Which is where it's equally as important to figure out who we're inviting into the test.
Sure.
So we'll typically screen people for things that we think are important in terms of that.
I would also think demographics in general are important, to sort this out.
Exactly. Yeah, matching the right people with your test and finding the right terms. So in my example there of tasty, in our language that would be what we call an attribute. So we will typically have a series of attributes that the client feels is important for their design to evoke, and we'll measure the automatic triggering of those attitudes. And that can work for simple constructs like tastiness, or does it look tasty? Does it look high quality? Does it evoke a feeling of for me? These kinds of things. But then if it's a more complex construct, so for example, going back to coffee, let's say it's a box of coffee, and maybe you want to have a design for your box of coffee that people will want to leave on their kitchen counter when their friends come over because they think it looks really cool.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's a little bit of a more complex concept to get across.
Yeah, it's a subtle idea.
It's a subtle idea, and it's a little bit more, requires a little bit more thought perhaps, and certainly reading time in terms of if you express that, it probably takes more like a sentence than just a couple of words to express.
Mm-hmm.
So there we will use a different type of test. We call them fast choice tests that are measuring a conscious response. So I'm directly asking you a question. You are consciously controlling what your response is, but I'm requiring you to try and respond quickly, and I'm measuring how long you take to respond.
Right.
And that's measuring that attitude accessibility concept that I mentioned earlier.
All right. That's, very cool. Still, it's interesting to just think about the shape of these tests, that different people's preferences, like you're going to have to test a lot of people to sort of cancel out those individual preferences.
Well, different tests will have recommended sample sizes.
Okay.
But the thing that we're really looking for is a design of whatever it is, packaging design or whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm.
I've talked about packaging designs a lot, but we also measure things like print ads or concepts or sounds, even like audio logos, that kind of thing.
Yeah, they're all kinds of packages, right? The first thing, the headline of a story or the sting of a show coming in, like those are all kinds of packages that let you know what's coming next.
Yeah, forms of communication that I would say that the main thing that we're looking for is something that will evoke a predictable effect in a significant number of people.
Right.
So it's no good. It's no good if you have a complete spread of responses. You're looking for a design, a poster design or whatever it might be, that is going to have a predictable effect in a large number of people.
Yeah.
Because that's the game we're playing in terms of things that work in the marketplace. It may just be that certain designs overall average out having no significant effect. And that's also useful to know.
Right. That you don't see a standout in all of these different designs, that they all have about the same effect, which designers are never happy when you say things like that.
Yeah, well, I think typically it's more like we're trying to find one design from a range of their design options that shows the most promise. And then we can have a discussion with them about maybe there are things that they can do to enhance it.
Interesting. So you might come in with 6 designs, you do a set of tests and show one with some preference, and then maybe optimize that design to take it up further.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay.
So we might see, another test that we use is eye tracking. And maybe we see that people are looking at a particular part of the pack design that's not really very important. Mm-hmm. And then we figure out why are they looking there and how you might, slightly reconfigure the design to direct their attention to the more important things.
You've come up with a test design here that will tell me of these 6 designs, this one seems to be preferred, but we don't necessarily know why that one is preferred. So I do find it interesting that now you would revise that design to try and nail down the why?
Well, we have what we call a series of neuro best practices, things that are known from the neuroscience and psychology literature around how people react to images, and also just things that we've learned over time through running many of these projects. And we're often able to hypothesize why people are responding in a particular way based on the basis of those neuro best practices. But often we'll run a series of tests and we'll be comparing and contrasting a series of different measures, which will often provide clues as to why a particular design is performing in the way it is. And then often we'll iterate with the designers as well. They'll make some changes and come back and retest.
Right. And I also appreciate this idea. There's not one right, perfect solution. You will iterate multiple times. And then as your competitive landscapes change, that package design or that particular headline approach become less effective.
Exactly. Yes. And one of the things that you see with very successful brands is their success gives them permission to do one of 2 things, which can be quite effective. They can either become a lot simpler in their visuals and still be recognizable.
Right.
So if you're driving down the freeway and you see a big billboard that simply has a big yellow curvy M, you know instantly that that's McDonald's.
You already know what it is. I was thinking the other big brand that's just red and white, and maybe a swoop.
Right.
You don't even need a word. That's how iconic that brand has become.
So one of Coca-Cola's most successful repackaging initiatives, I think if not the most successful repackaging initiative, was a thing they did over the last few years where on bottles, they replaced the word Coke with another word. And there were a whole series of different words that they used. So in one campaign, they would do different names. So you might be able to go into the store and find the can of Coke with your name on.
Wow.
And they did ones with different holiday destinations. But the thing that's so powerful about it is that even though they'd completely removed the word Coke, it was still instantly recognizable because the power of the color, the font, the particular style of lettering was immediately recognizable.
Wow.
And that gets to the whole thing I was talking about earlier around making things simpler and the power of things being familiar or simple. There's a kind of a twist to that, which is that if things are even more simple than you expect them to be, or they're familiar but in a different way, there's something that kind of delights us about that.
Yeah, that's exactly the word I was thinking. Is that's delightful, especially in this era of, attention being so pulled upon that I can recognize something and I can identify something and with the least amount of friction. That is delightful.
A good example of that in everyday life is if you go outside of your house and you look over and you see your neighbor there and you recognize your neighbor, that might be a fairly pleasant thing just to say good morning to your neighbor. Mm-hmm. If you're now in a completely different context, maybe you're in the middle of a busy city crowd or you're in the middle of a busy airport and suddenly you recognize your neighbor, you'll almost certainly smile. It will create a positive reaction in you because you've recognized someone but in a completely unfamiliar context.
Yeah.
And you didn't expect to see somebody there that you recognize.
And I certainly have seen that reaction with products in a place you didn't expect, right? You travel to a foreign land and go into a store and you see a brand you recognize.
Yes. So the implication or the kind of the learning of that for designers is that, can you pare down a design and make it simpler and simpler and simpler to a point where it's still recognizable, it's still communicating what it needs to communicate?
This is fascinating because it also speaks to an evolution of our marketing to reinforce our relationship with our customers.
Yeah, and it's also going back to the principle about our brains wanting to save energy.
Sure.
There are theories around what is it about something, an image or something that we're looking at that makes it intriguing or makes us want to stare at it, makes us fascinated, captures our attention. And there's a theory that you can think of an image as having information content in the same way that food has nutritional content or nutritional value, informational value, let's say. And you can have a pattern that is meaningless, like wallpaper. In terms of the sheer amount of visual information, there might be a lot of visual information there, but there's no meaning there.
Right.
Whereas you can have a very, very simple logo that has many, many different meanings that it can trigger.
Yeah, but also a lot of very personal relationships too. If it's a known brand, like people carry relationships with that brand.
Yes.
You talked about this, sort of pre-caching effect, this, bringing those thoughts forward. You see that and you trigger all those effects.
Right. So with just a few strokes of a pen, you could draw the two big circular ears and the kind of the mouth of Mickey Mouse. And with very minimal visual information, that would trigger a whole series of associations.
Right. Yeah. Matt, very, very powerful. Darren, I feel like we're almost going into another topic here of the evolution of folks' brands, which is very cool. But I really appreciate your time just sort of digging into how we construct these relevant tests to understand how people will perceive our products in the context that they see them in, too. I think that's an interesting aspect of this, is like on the shelf versus in the hand. Like it's all cool stuff. I really appreciate your time.
Oh, you're very welcome.
And we'll have to talk again, I think. And I appreciate everyone listening to this, and I hope this has helped you understand a little bit more about consumer neuroscience.